So my pleasurable duty is to introduce the President, Professor Deborah Ashby, and let you know some things about her. Deborah Ashby is Director of the School of Public Health and holds the chair in Medical Statistics and Clinical Trials at Imperial College London. She is the fourth woman to become President in the Society's 185-year history. Deborah is Honorary Member of both the Faculty of Public Health Medicine and the Royal College of Radiologists. She was awarded the OBE for Services to Medicine in the 2009 New Year's Honours List, was appointed an NIHR Senior Investigator in 2010 and elected to the Academy of Medical Sciences in 2012. After studying a mathematics degree at the University of Exeter, she took her master's at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, followed by a PhD and postdoc at the Royal Free, which is now part of University College London. She then took up a lectureship at the University of Liverpool in a joint post across the Mathematics Department and the Department of Public Health, where she spent 11 years, followed by 11 years as a chair at Queen Mary University, back in London. She has been at Imperial for 10 years, where she was founding co-director of the Clinical Trials Unit, then appointed Deputy Head of School, and more recently Head of School. Deborah's research interests are in clinical trials, risk-benefit decision-making for medicines, and the utility of Bayesian approaches in these areas. She has chaired the NIHR HTA Commissioning Board and is chair of the Population Research Committee for Cancer Research UK. Over her career, she has carried out research on cystic fibrosis studies, heart disease, cancer, dementia, and depression in the elderly. She also spent many years on government committee for the regulation of medicines. As well as academic and government roles, Deborah has also engaged in public-facing work, including appearances on BBC Two's Newsnight to discuss cancer research findings, BBC Radio 4's Inside Health to explain adaptive trials, and on More or Less to talk about the RSS Statistics of the Year and her new presidency. She has even appeared on a 2018 Christmas special alumni version of BBC's University Challenge, which I'm sure you all saw. Deborah has been a member of the RSS for many years, which, she says, has helped her keep up to date with wider developments in statistics and data science, as well as keep abreast of how statistics are being used in other areas. After joining the Society's medical section, she became its secretary in the late 1980s. She spent 6 years on the Society's council and then honorary secretary for a further 6 years, where she worked on membership, events, conference, and governance issues. Since then, she remained active in the Society and chaired its 175th anniversary committee, as well as its first long-term strategy review. I have great pleasure inviting Deborah to give her presidential address.
Thank you very much, Guy, for that kind introduction. So we're here tonight for yet another presidential address. And what I want to do is use this to look back a bit at what the Society has been, where it's come from, to think where we are now, and then to look to what I think are the big issues that are coming. So some 200 years ago, various people, mainly men, were sitting around in groups discussing statistics, and at some point some of them thought, well, we should have a society, became the London Statistical Society, and that grew. And the record of it is written really in the Royal Charter, and I won't read it all out. The Royal Charter was gained in 1887, but what it did was kind of almost summarise what had been going on for the past 50 or so years, which is why it was then allowed to have its Royal Charter. And the essence of the first bullet point is collecting, arranging, digesting and publishing facts. Yeah, very objective. And the point of those was to illustrate society and its prospects. Largely these were tables of various things. There were some principles there, but probably not very much what some of us would recognise today. It also published transactions, as they were called then, and its discussions, of which this meeting is almost a sort of discussion meeting. And it was recognised in the Royal Charter as a contributor to the progress of statistical economical science. And then also what it had done was communicating, extending statistical knowledge and general interest now felt in statistics. So those are the things that made it worthy of having a Royal Charter. I would put those more succinctly about using data for the public good. There was the idea of developing statistical science and building statistical capacity is the language I would use, and those are the sort of three threads that I want to sort of track through. It also said, it's very clear on this point, there shall be a president, which is what gives me the great privilege of being that president, the honour of being that president, but also the chance to reflect tonight. Now, there have been lots of presidents, and we are all inscribed on that board. And we're going to meet some of them tonight. So there are these three that, of course, every member of the society will immediately recognise. You let off if you're one of the guests that's here. And then, well, can't have it all as men, so a bit like these great multi-author papers, you miss out the middle ones, you put your own name if it's your CV, and then, of course, you have the two last authors. So this is what presidents look like. Well, yes, no, they've gone back to being even more bearded than they were in those photos. There's one without a beard. Right, so who were they? Well, one of these, and he is named in the Charter as one of the sort of 5 or so fellows that was asking for the Royal Charter, because that's the convention, is somebody called William Farr. And he doesn't look very young in this, but actually one of the things he was done as a young fellow was to be appointed to what was called the General Registrar Office. And he went in probably almost as a jobbing statistician. He was on a temporary contract. Well, for what he did, he should have had Temp of the Year, because what he did was get involved in the census. He was involved in calculating life tables. And when I was reading through this, what I was struck by was that Babbage, who was one of the other fellows that later helped set up the Royal Statistical Society, is well known for his calculating machines. And Farr, with his mounds of data that he was clearly drowning in, wanted a calculating machine. I mean, you can kind of understand why. And there's all this wonderful correspondence that he wanted one. Would the British government fund it? No, they would not. Eventually, I think the Swedish government got on with it, and he managed to get one. And then actually, it seemed to give them more trouble than it was worth. And I think for the census, they actually went back to doing things by hand. And I thought, this just echoes. But what it says to me is that what he was trying to do was to use data for the good of society. He was trying to develop methods which include the computational aspects. And what he was trying to do was to build capacity to build things at a greater scale. So another well-known name, William Guy, this is Guy as a surname as opposed to Guy Nason first name, was initially honorary secretary. And when I was reading through the presidential addresses, I was quite amused to stumble across, I thought we should just use this guy, an honorary secretary's address. And this was actually quite profound. He was really meditating on what we mean by statistics. It's got the most wonderful title on the original and inquired meaning of the term statistics and on the proper functions of statistical society and on the question of whether there be a science of statistics, and if so, what is its nature and objects, and what is in relation to political economy and social science. I can't see Martin Owen let anyone get away with a title that long now. But what he did was to tease out the two meanings of statistics that I think we still very much go by. One of which is statistics linked to the word state and data, and finding out about the condition of society to understand it. And what I sense is a hope that if you could understand it, somehow you could then do something about it. And the other, and he has a long meditation on what is meant by science, but he eventually gets the fact that there is a science of statistics. There's a proper way of doing these things. It's not just a matter of collating the numbers and putting them out there, but you have to do it in a sort of principled kind of way. But he then rapidly, he could have just stopped there, but actually he then flags up what are the areas in which should we be doing. And it's quite a shopping list. Education, crime, industry, health, wealth, manufacture, commerce, special branches of industry and production. It was a huge agenda. Not surprisingly, somebody that ambitious then got to be president, and he also got to give a presidential address. It was quite interesting reading that, because that is a much odder kind of conflation of what I would call a report to council before it gets on to anything that you might call a presidential address. So in council this afternoon, as usual, we were discussing buildings, how we can renovate it, and Guy was certainly very exercised by buildings. We discussed membership. We're actually doing very well on membership. And when you think of the scale of his ambition a few years previously, the society at that time was numbered in its hundreds. And he said the society ought to count its members by the thousands, not by the hundreds. Well, certainly met that. We're at about 6,000 paying members now, and I think we've just gone over about 10,000 if you include all the kind of e-students and teaching members. So, we're going up by orders of magnitude, which you need for the kind of ambition that he had. And then he got on to the substance of it, which was John Howard's work on prisons and remarks on condition and prospects of society. And they were wide-ranging and included, we might not use this language now, but there's certainly topics we would still very much care about: poverty, vagrancy, imbeciles and prisons. And I'm not quite sure whether words like imbeciles actually carried the sort of connotations they now carry, which is why we don't use them. But the sense of what he was looking at was absolutely there. So, that was William Guy. Another figure that looms large, Charles Booth. Now, Charles was from a rich Liverpool family, and he was involved in all sorts of things. So William Guy gave money which was used for medals, and there are indeed people who hold his medals sitting in the audience. Charles was the first Guy Gold Medal winner. And he gave his presidential address in 1893. And what I was impressed about was that Charles had put a lot of work into the 1891 census. And he got on with the analysis, and at least for the London part of that, he actually presented it for his presidential address in 1893, which I think, given the technology of the time, was quite phenomenal. I'm feeling very relieved there's not going to be a census on my watch. It comes just after, so there's no pressure on the next president. But, given modern technology, it'd be very nice if in 1921, in 2021, we can have an analysis of the census that took place a couple of months earlier. I mean, why shouldn't it be possible? He also got involved in collecting data on poverty. He he had a cousin by marriage, Beatrice Webb, better known as Beatrice Potter to those with young children. And he read a paper to the Society a bit later, and he used that in his maps to argue for the introduction of old age pensions. So again, put to really good use. And I couldn't resist showing some of his maps. These aren't in the written version, partly because I don't think we could reproduce them well enough. Actually, they're not shown brilliantly on the slide. But he went round collecting data all over London, and this shows, see if I can point out, that's Buckingham Palace there, that's the Houses of Parliament, that is what was Millbank Prison, I think by then was changing over to Tate Modern. But the colour coding is interesting because a lot of that map is gold, and gold means you're nice and rich, you're upper class. The red middle is well-to-do, whereas it goes down, and if it's blue, light blue, you're pretty poor, dark blue, you're very poor, and the black, of which there's not a lot on that version, is lowest class, vicious, semi-criminal. And again, language we wouldn't use now, but what I want to contrast that with, so that is mainly yellow with the bits of red. If we then look at round here, so that's Bun Hill Fields, and the society is, I think, just going across there, it's no gold in sight. It's very much either blood red, which is mixed, and then if you go over here, you've got these much dodgier areas where you really shouldn't go over towards the Charterhouse. So very visual ways of representing what was going on. Now, the other person that I cannot pass up without looking at, and actually the more I read, the more I was fascinated by what she'd written, is Florence Nightingale. She is known to world over as the Lady with the Lamp. She's also fairly well known, very well known in statistical circles as a pioneering, passionate statistician, and she was the first woman fellow of the Royal Statistical Society. She went nursing in Crimea, but quickly got to looking at data, and when she came back, she worked with William Farr on that data. And what that enabled her to do, she didn't just stop there doing the analysis, she then went and lobbied for royal support and got a commission going on that. She then turned her attention to London hospitals, and I think it's fairly clear to most of us that she did far more good for the health of populations by her statistics than she ever did by her nursing. But reading a bit further, other things struck me, and one of the reasons for reading further is, of course, it is her 200th birthday next year, so the Society are thinking, along with plenty of other people, how we're going to celebrate this. So that's just, again, this is well known in statistical circles, and if you go to the Science Museum, you'll see these. These are some of her visual graphics. But what she was also passionate about, and I hadn't realised this as much, although other people clearly had, is education. She had actually, when she was younger, taught at a ragged school in Westminster, and that gave her insights into the effect of poverty, which stayed with her for the rest of her career. And when she found problems, her solution was generally to recommend education. So, soldiers, there were things she took umbrage with about them, and her solution was champion education. Army doctors, again, there were things that she really didn't like what they were doing. She championed education. One of the reasons she's so well known is that she set up a Nightingale School of Nursing, St Thomas's, with really detailed specification about how it was set up, including that each nurse should have her own room. Bliss in this day of open plan offices. And she said education is to teach men not to know but to do. She saw it as a means to a practical end, not as something in its own right. And this wonderful quote, I almost feel like getting Sheila Bird to read this one out. I can see her saying it. Our chief point was that the enormous amount of statistics at the moment available at their disposal, and she's talking about politicians here, or in their pigeon-holes, which means not at their disposal, is almost absolutely useless. Why? Because the cabinet ministers and their underlings have had a university education by and large, but they haven't been taught anything about statistics. And that's what they need in order to actually do some good. I'm paraphrasing slightly, but it's a wonderful thundering thing. And I was just so struck by this image of the pigeonholes with the data in that could be useful, but they couldn't get it out because they didn't know what to do with it. So that's why I took that as part of my title. And again, familiar tale to many here. She proposed introducing statistics in studies at the University of Oxford. She was willing to sort of fund a chair of applied stats. Well, I tell you, offer that to Imperial, we'll bite your hand off. But it wasn't for the mathematical education. She was quite worried about that. It was to address, it was largely because the politicians are going through there, and she wanted them educated in statistics related to education, pineology, workhouses, and India, which is another one of her passions. And for various reasons, probably because it was a bit too practical, Oxford didn't take that. But again, it's interesting that education was her answer. She was also very critical of the education available to women at her age and the limited expectations society had of their role. And that gives me just an excuse to put up another woman that you will not have heard of, which is my grandmother. Now, why is that relevant? I just thought of as this slightly bitter woman in Liverpool that obviously wasn't very keen on kids. And much later I talked to a much younger sister who said she'd been very bright at school, she'd wanted to stay on, her dad was in occasional work and that money didn't make its way home. So when her head teacher came round to say, I'd like her to stay on for the last 2 years at school, her mum said no, I needed to go out to work. Her head teacher said, I'll pay for her, presumably the school fees. And Mum said, no, she's got to go out to work. And when my grandmother came home, she put 2 shillings on the table and said, well, that's the price of education. And I thought, no wonder she was bitter. Now, she was a very bright bridge player, as was her younger sister. She also did musical theatre. And I thought, what more do you need to be? She should have been a stats lecturer at the University of Liverpool. Yeah. She had talent there that was not put to use. So it's personally frustrating for her, but it's also lost use. Actually, a bit of an instinct of probability and the ability to stand up here. You don't need much more to be president. I mean, that's where the women who aren't on that board were. I mean, she had a good life, but such a wasted opportunity. So, back to Florence Nightingale just briefly. She was primarily interested in action, as we've said. She was obsessed by sanitary stuff in India, and that was going very slowly, and any normal person would have thought, well, that's too far away, can't do much about it. But again, I was very struck. She said, I never lose an opportunity of urging a practical beginning, however small, for it's wonderful how often in such matters the mustard seed germinates and roots itself. And sometimes we're confronted with great big problems, and again, that's useful. And she was deeply religious, so you can see where that analogy came from, but actually a lot of religions use the same analogy for probably obvious reasons. So what we've talked about so far is data and largely observational and doing something based on observational data. Experiment was really not there, but it was beginning to happen in agriculture. There's a wonderful place in Harpenden where they've done a series of experiments that got to be called the long-term or the classical experiments. And they were to investigate effects on crop yields of all the kind of things you might put onto crops and placements. And again, they were drowning in data. You know, it may not be big data by our standards, but it certainly was by theirs. So they engaged a young fellow called R.A. Fisher. And he was appointed just to analyse the data. And actually what it led to was real serious work on design, the development of what we call analysis of variance. So what started off as probably just a couple of years' job led to things that were really life-changing. What Peter Armitage highlighted in his lecture was that actually in medicine for a long time, again, it was just about counting and enumerating. The idea of experimentation didn't really come in until Bradford Hill. And that, again, is a fairly well-known story. But reading back or reflecting on Peter, actually, as well as developing and arguing for experimentation, and he did get there in his presidential address in the end, but because he was reviewing medicine, a lot of it wasn't about that, Peter realised the need for capacity development. And what he did in 1969 was to set up a master's course at the School of Hygiene. And those there are the first 5 students, and I think that's Richard Hayes in the middle, who later taught me. That has just celebrated its 50th anniversary, and I thought actually this was the 50th anniversary, but it's not, because those 2 chaps at the front are actually Peter Armitage and Michael Healy, who were there, so it's a picture from the 40th, but there are hundreds of graduates, and I thought, what a brilliant example of mustard seed. You start, and I think the expansion of medical stats owes quite a lot. I mean, not only that, but that's played a very major role. So we've got these recurrent themes that are coming up from our past. So I want to start thinking, what do they mean now? Well, using data for public good, there's lots of debates which are better rehearsed elsewhere, and I won't go into them in great detail, but balancing privacy and competing interests of the researchers or the company resources who've created that data are things that we are really grappling with. And if we go back to Charles Booth, he had little footnotes on his address about the confidentiality issues. They don't go away. Census data generally is made available, anonymised, for any purpose, but it's generally released in stages, and the last bits aren't often released till 100 years hence. Whereas we have the nation's health data, or at least 10% of it, in CPRD, which lots of people would love to be able to just use, but it's only released against protocol. So we've got some very different conventions in different parts of the world, and the All Trials campaign to make trial data available is ongoing. So there's lots of debates about how data should be made available. In terms of developing a statistical science, Peter Diggle addressed that in his address, and it's the kind of modern day analogue of Farr wanting William Babbage's machine. What we have got, though, I've put that up again because the reason I could do these graphs and the reason you can interrogate it is LSE and now you have used computers to put that online and all the notebooks that go with it, which is a phenomenal resource. We've also, and I'm showing something from my colleague Majid Azati, looking at the risk factor collaboration, which is international. Not only is the data online, but with various kind of buttons that you can interrogate it and do things with it. So the ways of making data available for people have moved on leaps and bounds, and computation is absolutely at the heart of that. There's investment from government. The HDR UK is a multi-funder initiative to unite the UK's health data and help us get that, which is a huge challenge, but it needs looking at scale, and the Turing Institute's been set up as the National Institute of Data Science. So there's lots of investment in developing not just statistical science, but all the sciences around them. What's happening with trials? Well, there's a whole infrastructure with trials. Many of us here either have done or currently work in trials units. I'm struck by what happened with children's leukemia, because there was a protocol in existence for some years where every child who went in for treatment in the UK went into an appropriate protocol. That graph just shows the difference between your survival rates if you're in a trial versus the not. But that graph shows the change in children's survival. So down here we've got children's survival 1978, 1979, gradually improving, and that's the data sort of just after the turn of the century, 0304. So a phenomenal change in children's survival, really down to a very, very systematic approach to trials, which I'll come back to it later, but hasn't been widely replicated. But I think it shows what's possible. In terms of developing statistical science, the RSS has played a role in drug regulation by highlighting that statisticians weren't involved in drug regulation. Many of us here were signatories to the 1991 report that wasn't the only thing that led to statisticians being employed in the Medicines Control Agency, but it was certainly one of the things. And now, 30 years on, if you look at what's going on, the statisticians are in the agencies, they're helping drive statistics. So again, the RSS has played its role there. Huge debate, which might come back to, on trials versus what's called real-world evidence, so this debate about experimentation versus observation. And several of my predecessors, and probably more than I'm showing there, have addressed this issue of statistical capacity. What I'm saying here isn't new, but in different ways. John Pullinger really championed statistical literacy in the general community, and Valerie was more concerned about the effect on the actual profession, but it's a major theme. What's going on now? Well, in the spirit of getting out and doing something, there's Jane Hutton at the Africa Initiative in Mathematical Sciences. And when I talked to the research students conference the other day, one of those girls came up to me and said, I've just come here to do my PhD because of that connection. So again, small things can lead to a lot. We're also doing lots of other things. Statisticians for Society is where we're enabling small charities who need stats input to get free advice from our fellows, and the fellows are being properly supported doing that, and we've got lottery funding for doing that. Data Manifesto was lobbying prospective members of Parliament at the last election to sign up that if they got elected, they would go on stats courses. Many of them signed up. Some of them actually took us up on that once they were elected. We're running training courses, and then other organisations, UKRI, have just made a massive investment in training grants. So, it's an exciting time, but I think there's more to be done. So turning, and I could have talked a lot more about all of these initiatives, but I just wanted to sort of do a bit of a stock take. So just looking at where we might be in 200, because we're 185 years old now, which means that in 15 years we should be celebrating our 200th anniversary. I chaired the working party for our 175th. I just expect turn up and just enjoy the 200th. So this is really a challenge to the younger ones among you. And I include my daughter in that. So Guy flagged up these areas of education, crime, industry, health. Have we solved them all? Well, we've solved some things. There's just a whole lot more. So those have not gone away in the way that you might have thought that they would. But what I wanted to flag up was a couple of areas that our forefathers were not concerned about that we do need to be. One of those is that partly as a result of work that statisticians have done in collaboration with doctors and partly as a result of good old public health, our life expectancy has increased immensely. What that brings is challenges of health and indeed social care for a really ageing society, and in particular people with multimorbidity, which means more than one health condition. But the soon-to-be Chief Medical Officer Chris Whitty shows some wonderful graphs showing the proportion of over 85s in some parts of the country, and it's really frightening. You think, who is going to be looking after them? How are we going to arrange ourselves? It's a massive issue. And it brings with it, I mean, Booth is there because he argued for the old age pension. My goodness, we've got a pensions crisis because suddenly these people are living. Some of us, I'm not yet, but I will hope to do soon, collect my pension. And there isn't quite enough money to go around. There's also statistical issues, and some of you, if you were listening to the radio at 6:15 this morning, you will have heard Jane Hutton explaining, well, some rather difficult political stuff, but actually explaining some stuff about assumptions that are going into the pensions modelling underlying the university superannuation scheme. So there's lots of challenges for statisticians there. She said she might be coming in later. She's at some other event at the moment that's, I think, fairly related to that. So those are the consequences of an ageing society, are ones that we have to grapple with, and there are certainly many statistical issues in that. The other big one, and it's not my world at all, but it would be remiss not to flag it up, and it's interesting, this just did not impinge on those who started the society, is the area of environment. As I was writing this, the United Nations report on loss of diversity and species loss was being trailed, at least the headlines. But actually, I might feel I know very little about it, but there are those in the society who have been doing work, and I'm absolutely delighted this year that the Guy Medal in Gold, which you just saw the first holder, that is going this year to Steve Buckland, who has done a lifetime's work in environmental statistics. And we also now have the Barnett Award, which is the only one that really carries with it a responsibility, as Peter knows, because you can't just take it in joy. You have to give a lecture. And we're going to have Marion Scott giving that lecture at the RSS conference in Belfast. And I think that's a really good signal that some statisticians have been doing sterling work in this for a very long time, and it's now much higher profile. But the statistical challenges in that kind of data, I feel quite overwhelmed by, and kind of, it's one for the future generation. In terms of using data for public good, the nature of data is changing. It's absolutely everywhere. I mean, that's a misquote of the rhyme of the ancient Marrier. Data, data everywhere, and not a drop to think. I thought it was quite original, and then I Googled it. I found, of course, several other people had thought of the same thing. And what I've got there is spatial data. Anybody recognise the top one? No, it's not. It's actually Facebook connections, and that is Australia. You should recognise Australia, Peter. I got our wonderful media guy at Imperial. I said, can you find me some images to brighten up this talk? And he came back with that. I said, what's that? Yeah, that's a data source. That is, recognise that? That is the vast crowd that were there for Trump, not. Now, in one sense, that photo itself is data, but you can also, you've got mobile phone data that's sometimes used for estimating size of crowds. So you've got data has taken on a completely different meaning from what it meant previously. We've also got the 2021 census coming up. And one of the things of using data for public good is that gives us a big opportunity for public debate and dialogue on things like value, confidentiality, trustworthiness. If we get it wrong, it's going to backfire dreadfully. But hopefully there will be a good public consultation. Again, the RSS has got a role to play in that. We're not the only ones. And the health data sets that we're collecting, maybe we can use to run trials, and there are people investigating that. So still plenty of opportunities for using data for public good in new ways. It begs the question of what our relationship with data is, and I've been grappling with that. I felt I should be able to say something definitive and proud, and actually I'm just sort of floating ideas because I'm struggling. Part of me thinks of data a bit like tax. I pay in, and I benefit from it when I need it. I don't say, well, I'm not paying in because I don't need to use that particular hospital service at the moment, or I don't need to collect my benefits. So, some idea of people's data or a shared resource, and he's our Executive Secretary, writes much more eloquently than I do about this kind of stuff. I was trying to think through The Gift Relationship, which was the Richard Titmus's book. And that's about blood donation, which again, I happen to give blood fairly easily, so I do it. And you give it, and the question is whether it should be voluntary or whether it should be a paid basis, which is how the states run. And his argument is it's far better, all sorts of reasons, on a voluntary basis. But when I showed a draft of this to actually a non-statistical colleague, she said, well, that doesn't work for private industry, does it? And the other thing I don't like is it's voluntary, because I'm rather nervous about the idea that I can leave some data but not other data. It's fine for a trial, but for some other things we do need everyone's data, and these are really difficult issues. And I back away from regulation. I'm being involved in medicines regulation. It can set up a bureaucracy which gets in the way of doing things, and yet every time I think about it, I think you need proper kind of governance things that say, for this purpose, what's the right thing to use? Where do you need individual consent? Where do you need opt-in? Where do you need opt-out? And it's a massive one that, again, society is already well engaged in, but it's not going to go away. Developing statistical science. So just a couple of areas to flag up. I've just mentioned the census. Every census sort of is developed on from the previous one, so the last one had much more individual level data rather than just thinking of it as household. This one is online. And you may not have heard too much about it at the moment unless you're in the trade, but you will be fairly soon, because although the census date is April 2021, the data collection will be from the end of 2020, and what they're going to be doing fairly soon is piloting it, which is why there's this public debate. What they're also planning on doing is calibrating the older and newer methods, and based on that, to then be able to provide up-to-date population estimates on a kind of much more continuing basis, rather than this brilliant estimate every 10 years, and then gradually getting rapidly out of date because populations shift in unpredictable ways. So that's a space to watch. And challenges about how we communicate this data. And this is just to flag up that people have been thinking about that for a while, and I couldn't resist pinching a couple of things from the Understanding Uncertainty website that I would point you towards. And actually what I'm struck by is, if anything, those are rather simpler than the other ones. And so that is just how you show one bad event out of a set of good events. This one is about breast screening and trying to trade off what will happen if you don't attend screening, what will happen if you do attend screening, what will happen if you won't, and what the differences are. And certainly I've looked at those when I've been making my own judgments, and they're really helpful, and I think they're almost deceptively simple because it's really got to the essence of it. So still challenges there. Trials. At one stage, I sort of thought, well, we kind of know how to do trials. They are changing. Adaptive trials, and Alexander Mason's here. We worked very hard on one adaptive trial, and really fascinating statistical challenges about how you do it. That's why I was really glad to involve Alexina, because I could see what the questions were. I just couldn't quite work out how to do the solutions, but she could. And they sometimes challenge regulatory paradigms, which are very much fixed around the two-group trial. And one of the varieties of adaptive trials is called platform trials. And what this is a trial called Stampede, which is looking at prostate cancer. And the reason that there are lots of horizontal bars there is that the idea, and this started back in 2006, is that there are lots of treatments coming along, and so they've all tried at once. Some of them dropped off. There's the potential to introduce new treatments, and there are more planned. And to me, this is absolutely the successor of the childhood leukemia trials, and philosophically, really the continuation of the long-term experiments, the idea of sort of continuous experimentation. Now, that looks very easy like that. If you listen to Matt Sides and Max Palmer and others talk about them, they are really difficult. They're logistically difficult, they're difficult to fund. Is it one trial, is it several trials? What happens when the treatments disappear rather faster than you think? But nevertheless, it seems to me that it's the right way to go about it, rather than just having sort of sets of scrappy trials that sometimes happen and sometimes don't. We've got a culture of trials in health, which is why we're now onto this really quite nuanced debate about what kind of trials we're having. Stella Cunliffe, who I showed earlier because she was the first female president, was a government statistician, and when she was involved in other things, and when she went to the Home Office, she was sad to have left the field of experimentation behind. I think it's sad that she had to leave the field of experimentation behind when she joined the Home Office. Now, again, I've mentioned Sheila Bird. Sheila is a good advocate of doing trials in areas that other people don't tread, like criminal justice. But so we've got some good exemplars, and there are others, but the culture change is a long way off, and again, it's a sea change I would like to see changing. One of the big debates is, does big data obviate the need for experimentation? You know, like, you can just do away with all of those principles, and it's amazing how often the design principles keep re-emerging. So one of the areas, and Stephen Evans knows far more about it than I do, but in the world I live in, one of the big debates for a long time was the relationship between hormone replacement therapy, breast cancer and heart disease, with trials starting and then being stopped. And the trial data didn't seem to tally with the observational data. Nice pieces of work coming out of Harvard, actually kind of essentially analysing the observational data by reconstructing the experiment, taking out the kinds of women who would have gone into trials and looking at it that way. And that helps reconcile what the differences were, because essentially those analyses have been answering different questions. And it's not the whole story. But I was most interested recently, I went to actually talk by Kerry Mengerson, who first got me onto this, but when I looked up the paper by Javadi, I found that Sylvia Richardson, Chris Holmes are also involved, and arguing that there's actually a much more general role for design principles in the analysis of such data, and it's certainly on my personal list of things to go and find out more about when I've got a little bit more time. So it's on my personal education. It seems to me a really important idea, but I'm not at all surprised, actually, that design is emerging as an important theme yet again. Something else I want to flag up is that Florence Nightingale's ambition to increase statistical capacity is just more relevant than ever. Because when I wrote this talk, I was thinking, what am I trying to say? And I thought, oh gosh, there's all sorts of stuff going on. And then I realised that's the point. There's a huge range of complex problems, and it's not just that we need a bit more training. We need a kind of sea change. We need more depth of training. People like me need to understand design principles. We need to understand more about artificial intelligence, machine learning. But we need a step change in the quantity of people trained. And again, I'm not the only one saying this. The Royal Society have helpfully put out a report on data science skills that you can read, and it basically says we need more statisticians. They don't quite use the right language, but it's pretty much in there. So we need to understand our related disciplines. And one of the questions about how to do it at scale gets us to online courses. I mean, I love teaching face-to-face individuals, but I have to say at Imperial and lots of others are getting into the online space. We're doing it with Coursera, but there's EdXL and others. Because if you want to change things at scale, you need to make them available to people who can't come in face-to-face. And I mean, I think there's also an interplay between using those kind of things and then perhaps bringing people in for shorter periods. But whether you're doing just a single freely available MOOC, as they're called, or a full degree, it's something that is got to be part of the solution. It's easy to think that you need to train someone to be able to do data science or to be able to do the whole of statistics. Actually, they're not. These are team sciences. And the world, that's a picture from the Large Hadron Collider, where they do team science at scale. They have the most phenomenally multi-author papers. And I just love that picture because that's the team. I mean, it just changes the way we do things. You don't need to know everything yourself. You do need to know what you don't know, and but also how to work with people. I haven't got a picture for genetics, but again, that's very much a kind of almost community activity. And I think data science is really of the same ilk, maybe not quite on that scale some of the time, but we have to confront that. And it basically says, what's the role of statistics? And I think of statistics actually as a language, as a means of communication. And that starts to get quite interesting because those of you who speak foreign languages will know there's a common European framework of reference. And that doesn't say, well, you can either speak French or you can't. It says, well, maybe you've got this much ability at reading. I mean, I can read my way through just about any newspaper article with the use of a dictionary for the words of vocabulary I don't know. But if I go there and speak, I can, get fed in a restaurant and find my way somewhere, but I really can't have a fluent conversation. So on the different dimensions, I've got different levels. And just that idea that maybe you need different things at different times, because some of us are engaged in a lot of debates about how we're going to skill up 10,000 health data scientists, is it Peter we need, and also about others. And sometimes I think, are we thinking about a little bit of service level teaching for other kinds of people or statisticians? And actually I'm thinking of it much, much more as a spectrum, and how do we communicate between, and actually maybe we need to be teaching more about how we communicate with other scientists and others. So it I might not want to push that analogy too far, but I find it useful for thinking about what I'm trying to do at any one stage. Nightingale focused very much on politicians, and actually I was most amused to discover her maternal grandfather was a politician, which may be why she knew their importance, but also knew how to kind of work with them. But what's coming up, and it certainly wasn't there with our forefathers, but the RSS is getting to grips, but it probably needs to more, is the public are important too. So in health, we are dealing with public and patient involvement in a really serious scale, and words like partnership and co-production are the language of the day. It's not just asking patients what they think afterwards, it's working with them. As I kind of alluded to, the upcoming census provides a perfect opportunity for some of that. And what do we mean by the public? It's partly the media, it's partly the charities who put out good communications. Cancer Research UK do some wonderful stuff that helps you if you know someone who's got a disease or might have, and you want to find out about it, that I generally go to CR UK first. It's our elected representatives, politicians of course, and the individuals themselves. So the public has different meanings, and the RSS is quite good at working with these. But it's kind of, I like to think of it as team science writ large. That's actually, again, it's not a them and us, it's how do we work together. And the RSS has this really inclusive fellowship that invites in anyone, so we're actually really well positioned to do that. We need a diversity of skills. There are, I think, only 2 Peters who are president. I apologise if there's any others there. And interestingly, one of their common themes was this diversity of skills, and that's really just emphasising what I've just said. While we're on the subject of diversity, if you did an analysis of that board, sorry about this, I'm not getting, we have had some wonderful presidents called David. We've had some, I'm sure we have wonderful presidents called George or William, I don't know them. But we have more presidents called David than we've had women, and George, and William, and 1 or 2 others. Now, if Sylvia's nomination for council rep goes through, at least there'll be 5 of us, so we can start. I think we should have a competition, a league table of at least knocking off the chaps that we have knocked out, but we've got to go some before we knock David off. But at least if we go by first initials, there are 2 Ds, there may well be 2 S's. So, but even getting enough beginning with D to knock the Davids off their perch is going to take us some while. We had a Women in Science Day here, which was organised by the Young Statisticians section, History of Stats section, and 1 or 2 others. That's the T-shirt the Young Statisticians wearing. It was wonderful. The slightly odd thing about it was there were only 2 men in the entire room, and both of those were either, well, 1 member of RSS staff and 1 previous member of RSS staff. And it's not that I dislike men, but it just felt so natural. We've got a fairly diverse audience today, but that needs to come, but that is by no means the only dimension of diversity. It's one of the most obvious, and we need to get that right, but there's plenty of other dimensions. And we need, I could just leave out statistical education. We need to make sure that statistical education is widely available, because otherwise we actually perpetrate inequalities. If you're not properly trained, if you don't understand statistics, you can't participate in society as you should. And so there's a diversity issue there as well. So this breadth of approaches and applications that I've alluded to means we need really high-level statistical expertise, including this ability to work in highly multidisciplinary scientific and legal frameworks. I'm saying it specifically of statistics. I have to say that 3 of us went yesterday to the Parliamentary Links Day, which is science societies and politicians, and actually they were all saying the same thing. I thought they'd read my speech. John Kingman, this is Sir John Kingman the younger as opposed to Sir John Kingman, the previous president here, but the younger one has given a talk which Guy drew my attention to, again talking about skills being needed to come to another level in terms of depth and number of people's needed, and he has been in government for a long time and he's the chairman of the UKRI now, so if he thinks it, that's really quite important. And if we can rise that challenge, the potential for using data for the public good is enormous. So, where are we now? Well, that image of pigeon-holes is really rather out of date. My pigeonhole is sadly empty now. Most things arrive by email about 10 minutes before the meeting. But it stands for me for the databases that we don't know how to get the data out of. It stands to me, anyone feel like this? The emails, half of which will probably contain the emails telling you what the passwords are for the databases that you've forgotten. We are overwhelmed by data. It just looks a bit different. And when we feel overwhelmed, just remember what Florence Nightingale said. Just sow some mustard seeds. Those chaps who were sitting around discussing statistical things in the early 1800s couldn't have had any idea what they were starting. But if you engage a bit, you never know where it's going to lead. And that mustard seed can flower. And you don't have to have a grand plan when you start. You just have to sort of have your heart in the right place and just do something about it. So that's my parting shot. So thank you very much for listening, and I'm very proud to be president.
Thank you very much. I'd like to now invite David Spiegel, Hauser, to propose the vote of thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Guy. And thank you, Deborah, for a wonderful, wonderful talk. I love historical stuff. And to have this continuity made from these giants of Farr and Nightingale and Booth and Guy to the present day, I think it's just great, because you could just see the challenges they had are so similar to now. Of course, things are different now in terms of our capacity for computing and the problems that people are trying to tackle, but the basic issues still remain. And so, whether it's to do with the public good or the developing statistical science or building statistical capacity, I think it's a very nice division. And I'd like to talk about some of those challenges. First of all, though, I love this comment by Florence Nightingale about planting mustard seeds. She just says, just start something, just be practical and start something. Very good advice for, success manuals and things like that. Because she is well known, in fact, I was reading a biography of her recently. She was well known for starting campaigns, and if they didn't work, she'd stop. They should just give up, and that was it, and go on to something else. So she'd just start things off, and sometimes they took, and sometimes they didn't. It was very effective advice for influencing people. Her other comment is about data in pigeonholes, but later on down that quote, it says about the conclusions must be tested by results. And I think that gave a talk about her recently, and I think she'd been riveted by what work centres. because I think these are an extraordinary development that this country is leading the world in. We've got what NICE, of course, is the What Works Centre in Health, but we've got What Works Centres in crime and education and homelessness and all sorts of areas. And the education one is doing huge numbers of randomised trials in schools now. There's I should know the statistic. A very large proportion of schools are currently involved in randomised trials. And so this is changing the whole landscape, the whole attitudes to experimentation. And I think it's one of the extraordinary initiatives that, people in Victorian times, I would genuinely think would be very, very impressed by. One of the issues, of course, is in those studies is that often the evidence isn't fantastically good. They are trying to do randomised trials, but of course in many areas you don't do randomised trials. We've heard, that observational data is vital, and of course that's going to be one of the big areas in the future. Will be the appropriate handling of observational data. And we've always been interested in it. We've always thought, well, we have to have it. But in the future, that's what, in area after area, we're going to have all the data. The role of the survey, the nice sampling error and things like that is going to drop and drop in official statistics and elsewhere. And I think this is one thing in which statistical science really has to start paying attention. And my particular interest in this, which I think is important, is to do with how do you deal with systematic biases? How do you deal with the caveats? How do you deal with the fact that we know often our data isn't very good, and yet we want to draw some conclusions? And I think this is something that is never taught. Is never taught now, I don't think, in any statistical course whatsoever. We always assume x1 to xn is IID random variables from a normal distribution. Well, they never are. And they're going to be less and less. And we know the problems can arise from using biased data and assuming they generalize. Machine learning is really, and AI is wrestling with this issue at the moment. I think this is something a statistical profession really has to take seriously. My particular interest is twofold. First of all, the development of quality of evidence scales, such as GRADE, which is currently used in health, although I don't particularly like the language used around that. But I think this is absolutely vital. And my particular concern is work that I've done in the past with Becky Turner and others, is on the quantification of bias. Sander Greenland's got a recent paper where he's reviewed a huge number of attempts to quantify biases. In other words, not just to leave these systematic biases as a list of caveats in a sort of vague, well, the data isn't very good way, but actually say, well, how big might the biases be due to the fact that we haven't got a representative sample? This isn't quite the group that we want to study and so on. I think this is going to be a big major area and it's a big challenge for statistical science. The other area that Deborah pointed out was the fact that in the past, all these lovely domains of statistics didn't include environment and climate. And that, again, it's already, of course, fully established, but it's going to become even more important in the future. My presidential address was about trust and trustworthiness. And I think the idea of trustworthiness is staggeringly important. And as, in a way, statistics gets more politicized, well, it's always been politicized, but it's going to be even more politicized in the future. The use of scientific argument is now a matter of public dispute. I believe that our profession has to lead the way in demonstrating trustworthiness. That is now the central pillar, the first pillar on the code of practice of statistics is to demonstrate trustworthiness. And I'd just like to point to one example, which you may have heard on More or Less, which Kevin McConway was involved in as well, that a recent paper, remember the headlines about the insect apocalypse? Insects are going down at 2.5% per year, there may be no insects in 100 years, blah, blah. Huge coverage on that, and everyone's concerned about the decline of insects. However, that was a deeply untrustworthy piece of science. It was based on a meta-analysis, no original research. It was based, the studies were only, almost all in Europe, and yet the generalization was to the whole world. But crucially, they published their search terms, and their search terms they used for their systematic review was insect, survey, and decline. So they looked for papers about declining insects, and guess what? They concluded that insects were declining. I mean, isn't that amazing? And they were unapologetic about that when interviewed by Tim Harford. So we've got to be very careful of that, and we've got to resist the temptation towards what is known as white hat bias, which I think is a great term. It's on Wikipedia, so it must be real. And white hat bias is when, and it's usually associated with public health, but I think it can also be associated with climate environment, is when, because you're on the side of the goodies, you're allowed to fib. You're allowed to exaggerate, you're allowed to cut corners, you're allowed to overclaim, because we're right, and we're doing good, and so we're allowed to do that. I think we must absolutely fight that. We must be trustworthy. Otherwise, why should anyone take us seriously? Okay, so that's my little rant. So just to wind up now, the final pillar that I did was about capacity. And this is to do, as Deborah mentioned, with, we need huge numbers of people capable of thinking about data. I think it's the real challenge for stats education, which has been traditionally of the let x1 to xn be IID random variables from normal distribution. I really think this needs some serious thought about how appropriate this is for many people who have to learn stats. There's a certain mathematical group for whom that's appropriate. But I believe that in the era of data science, and the society, by the way, has done fantastically well at being welcoming to data science. Many people, especially in the States, who have been deeply concerned at being marginalized by, data science being taken over by computer science, and who needs statistics. And of course that has happened in some areas, and I believe that the sensible stats departments like Carnegie Mellon immediately renamed themselves statistics and data science. Grab the brand, get there. And RSS has been very successful in doing that. And I believe we will become the professional body for data science, and that would be a fantastic success in our work. But it does mean we have to change the way in which we think of statistics, the type of statistics that can be taught, and what it involves, what it means to be a data analyst or a data scientist and a statistician. We've got to change those ideas. Okay, so I would like to just finish by again thanking Deborah for a wonderful talk, a wonderful survey, inspired by the figures, these great figures in the past and their wonderful quotes. Let's forget the imbeciles and things like that. And I believe what she's done is to emphasize to us all what a wonderful specialty we work in. What a wonderful area. We should be so proud of being part of this group, this community. I don't think we're nice, and we're very critical of ourselves all the time. But actually, I believe we're a community of deep integrity, as I say in my foreword to my book, plug, also considerable nerdy and very pedantic, but basically decent people. And to tend not to have strong agendas apart from seeking out truth, honesty, justice, etc., all those wonderful things. So I'd really like to thank Deborah for giving us that inspiration from the past, that continuity into the future, 15 years' time, whoever will be president then, we wonder. It won't be a David, I'm sure. I think those have been and gone. And so I'd like to finally propose the vote of thanks to Professor Deborah Ashby.
Thank you very much, David. I'd like to invite Peter Diggle to second the vote of thanks.
Well, yes, it's a very pleasant and easy job to thank Deborah for that lecture. And like David, I don't think one can overemphasize the importance of learning from history. And certainly your short history of the society told me quite a number of things that I can't say I didn't know until tonight, because I did read the paper before I prepared my remarks. But certainly until I read your paper, I wasn't aware of. And one thing that struck me is that there's a sense in which we're coming full circle. And you've already seen the quote from Deborah, that in the early days of the society, there was a view that the job of the statistician was to assemble facts, but do not on any account try to interpret them, for God's sake. And of course, that would now seem very strange to us. But with the growth of so-called big data, there is a tendency, and I think it will be a shrinking tendency, I very hope it will be, but there is still a tendency to think that if you've got enough data, then the data become omniscient, and given a big enough data set, all questions can be answered. Now, I really hope that the near future of our discipline comes much closer to a rather pithy response to this point of view by Judea Pearl, and I quote, "You are smarter than your data. Data do not understand causes and effects. Humans do." And I think it's absolutely vital to the health of our discipline that we embrace data science, but we recognise that there is knowledge that it cannot be codified in the biggest data set imaginable. And if you don't combine that wisdom with the empirical information in the data, you kind of stymie your efforts to understand the world. Now, moving on a little bit, now it's certainly one of a number of things we should be grateful to data science for is that if you think about terms like big data, visualization, data science, and you think of the work of really outstanding communicators, we've got our honorary fellow Tim Harford as one example, we've got David as another outstanding example, and the late great Hans Rosling as a third. And so, if you're at a social gathering and people say, "What do you do?" You say, "I'm a statistician." Well, you no longer necessarily think, "Oh, where's that person? Why not talk?" It's a more than acceptable thing to be. And I actually don't think we should underestimate the importance of statistician not being automatically assumed to be a nerdy, esoteric thing, but is actually part and parcel of what makes society work. And I think that's really very, very important. Now, the many references that Deborah made to Florence Nightingale would be important in any year, given the immensity of her achievements, but particularly apposite, as she's told us, that it's the bicentennial of her birth next year. And unsurprisingly, and again, Deborah alluded to this, at Health Data Research UK, we've been actually giving some thought as to whether we might establish what I'm hoping might be christened a Nightingale lectureship team to prepare material on health data science and actually disseminate it widely among schools. And some of you will have noticed that this would be a shameless steal of the idea behind the Guy lectureship. And certainly I've had some very preliminary and informal conversations with Deborah and with Crystal Donnelly, but nothing would please me better than that this could become a joint venture between Health Data Research UK, who nowadays pay half my salary, and the Society, which has been an important part of my professional life for 40 more years than I care to remember. Now, another ambition for I think for the near future is, again, as David's alluded to, Deborah's alluded to, it's clear that you want statistical literacy in a broad sense to be central to intelligent society, rather than just a branch of mathematics that only specialised people can understand. As you will know if you read my presidential address, I have the greatest respect for statistical mathematicians, but statistical science has a much wider interpretation, and statistics for society a wider interpretation still. Now, one of the particular striking features of Deborah's lecture is how many memorable quotes she's assembled. And I would like to add one, which I'm sure many of you will have heard before, but it wasn't there tonight. And it's by the English writer, more known for his science fiction novels, H.G. Wells, who said, statistical thinking, bear in mind he died in 1946, statistical thinking will one day be as necessary for efficient citizenship as the ability to read and write. And I'd like to think that's true, but of course it doesn't seem to be necessary, despite the society's best efforts, to make a successful career in politics. So we've still got some way to go. Now, those of you who are aware of the society's more arcane traditions will realise that when I say I've now finished, I've actually signally failed in my duty. Because the great tradition of the seconder of the vote of thanks is to find some quibble. And I couldn't find one. So that makes it very easy for me formally to finish by seconding the vote of thanks to Deborah Ashby.